Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with Brooklyn-based jazz guitarist, composer, and bandleader Chris Jentsch. He talked about his latest project, the 2019 CD Topics in American History. He grew up in South Jersey, a suburb of Philadelphia, the land of cheesesteaks and hoagies. Formative listening experiences involve strumming a tennis racket to the Beatles songs, along with the radio, and being exposed to his father's Sinatra records. He's been based in New York City since 1999, and he's very busy. As a band leader and sideman, he has performed throughout the Northeast and Florida, and he's worked with such diverse musical personalities as George Russell, John Cage, Maria Schneider, Ira Sullivan, and Chris Wood. So please get to know him and dig this interview, my friends.
Hey, Matt, thank you for taking a minute to talk about American history and your life and music. I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
So let's start off with your latest CD, Topics in American History. And I kind of want to know what your vision for this project was.
I guess most of us have more than one interest in life, right?
Yeah.
And my interests are, I've always said eclectic, if that means varied. And one of them was American history. I grew up, my older brother was a history major when he went to college at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. So he studied the Civil War at Gettysburg. When I was coming up after him, I sort of had not even close to a clue about what I wanted to do. So I wound up just going to the same college he went to, I guess as a legacy. So I wound up being a history major at Gettysburg College also. I had some of the same courses, some of the same teachers that he had. So I've always had this sort of interest in history, particularly American history. But I've always also been interested in music. So I'm, listening to music in the 60s and Sinatra and the Beatles and so forth. And by the time I get to college, I'm playing guitar a little bit and I'm studying history. And eventually, I start going to college for music, not just for history. The history was just my first college degree, but then I went to college for music. So I started studying jazz and composition and classical music and all these other things. So there I have these two developed interests, but it wasn't until decades later that I found a context or an excuse to combine the two interests. I had this grant from Chamber Music America to write an hour's worth of music for my 9-piece chamber jazz group, and I thought, rather than just write, a bunch of separate pieces, I would try to write a suite which was thematically linked, and to have the hour of music be something a little bit more organized, and it would be a way to write music to the themes and the concept, and to have a little bit more of a unified hour-long presentation rather than just a bunch of tunes that work well together. So bringing history and music together was a natural thing, but it didn't happen until the 21st century, just this past 3 or 4 years. I'm sure that answers your question.
Yes, I love it. Yeah, that's great. That's a great overview. So let me go back to the beginnings of your life. You grew up in South Jersey, a suburb of Philadelphia. Talk to me about your childhood and how you got involved with jazz and playing music.
Well, the music started just because there was music in the house. There was a baby grand piano in the house. My dad played piano, so he always played sort of his versions of jazz standards at the time, although he wasn't at all playing them like in a jazz kind of way. He wasn't really improvising. He was playing jazz music sort of as pop music, which, as some of us know that know the history of the music, at some point in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, even into the 50s, jazz music was the pop music of the day. The top 10 singles, Body and Soul, All the Things You Are. These were hit songs, even versions of those songs with improvising. Now, my dad didn't improvise, but those songs were in my head. the songs that Miles Davis and Lester Young and all the others would be using for vehicles for improvisation, he was just consuming as pop music. So I heard them in his versions, which were just, straight readings, pop music versions of the tunes. Plus, he was playing a lot of records in the house. I had a steady diet of Count Basie and Frank Sinatra all through the 60s, and so that was a way to get those standard tunes into my head, the standard tunes that jazz musicians would be using at that time to learn the music. And then at the same time, my brother was feeding me Beatles music all through their entire growth spurt through the 60s. So I was strumming my tennis racket along with Beatles records and playing to an extent on pots and pans, playing Beatles songs. That's the basis of a lot of people have a sort of a much, I'll use the word eclectic again, eclectic background. They're combining classical music with rock, or they're combining rock with jazz. So that's how I kind of got into this idea of learning about jazz, the more I got into music, and using what I knew about rock and pop music and classical music to combine everything into my own sort of musical vibe. So I was growing up in the 60s with music in the house, and I was listening to Sinatra and the Beatles, basically. And then I got into college, and I started getting more into jazz through guitar players that were sort of fusion-type guitar players. The first ones I gravitated towards were like people like Al Di Meola, who had sort of a rock sound, was playing a fusion sort of repertoire. So I kind of got into jazz that way when I first started looking at jazz beyond, say, like my dad's Basie and Sinatra records.
So when did you know that you were going to dedicate your life to music and be a musician? Has that kind of been something that was done early on, or was it when you got into jazz in college? When did that happen?
Not till I got into jazz in college, I would say. I started, like I said, I got the American History degree at Gettysburg, and then I took a few years off and then started going to various jazz schools, accumulating various jazz degrees. And I kept going, several schools, till I had a master's degree. Then I took another few years off. Was having trouble making a living where I was at the time. So I decided to go back to school because I found a deal where I could get a tuition waiver and then get a doctoral program in jazz composition while teaching part-time at the same school. So that way you go and get your doctorate for free. So I kind of broke even with my expenses for 3 years, and then came out in 1999 with a doctoral degree in jazz composition. And at that point, I had gradually sort of decided that I would try to combine, composition and band leading and teaching and all these different things and try to get them together into a life in music.
So when you started in New York, you got in there and you got going. Things have obviously worked out really well. How did things kind of start to steamroll for you? Was it slow? Did it happen fast? What happened?
I would say it wasn't fast. What happened is when I got out of the doctoral program, I sniffed around for a few jazz teaching jobs and had a couple of interviews, but no job offers. So I decided to, instead of just staying where I was in Miami at the time, I decided to just up and move to New York, which is something that I never thought I would ever be able to do. But I had figured out gradually that a lot of my friends from a lot of my other college programs had wound up in New York City, but they weren't living in New York City, they were living in Brooklyn, which is still pretty citified if you're going to compare it to other parts of the country, but It's definitely a calmer vibe and a less expensive vibe than living in Manhattan. So I figured, all these friends of mine who I played with before, they're all living in Brooklyn. So maybe that's a way to approach the New York thing. I'll just move to Brooklyn. So it's 1999. I moved to Brooklyn and then started trying to get sideman gigs and started looking for ways to put bands together. And eventually I did some work at a non-profit composers service organization called the American Music Center. And at that place, working there, I learned a lot about the opportunities that exist for applying for grants to get some money to do some composition projects, some band projects, some recording projects. I started getting some grants here and there, and eventually I put a big band together because I had some money to fund the project, and that became Brooklyn Suite, I guess in the 2000 aughts. And then I got a couple more grants to do another big band project and some smaller group projects. So it kind of has sort of snowballed from starting from almost nothing in 1999 to a place where I'm mixing and matching teaching jobs with part-time teaching jobs with applying for grants and running my bands and writing music. It's been a good run. It's been very difficult to be, a jazz composer in New York City, but I wouldn't dare complain how it's worked out.
So early on in your life, what jazz shows did you see that really left an impression on you?
Well, the shows I generally mention about jazz, I think, happened in the 80s. I had started going to concerts in Philadelphia in the 70s in high school. Robin Trower, Genesis, Eric Clapton at the Spectrum, that kind of thing. But in terms of jazz concerts, it wasn't until the 80s, after I'd been to Gettysburg College, that I started really getting into jazz concerts. And the ones that were really super influential to me were the Art Ensemble of Chicago. I saw them probably 2 or 3 times in the 80s before any of their members died. So that was like the classic lineup of Art Ensemble. They would come out and they would play like for an hour without stopping, and they would go from tune to tune, and they would improvise segues between tunes, and so you'd have like an hour or more worth of music straight through. Now, the same decade, the 80s, I went to see Oregon, which is that classic group with Ralph Towner and so forth. So I saw them before any of their members died 2 or 3 or 4 times in the 80s. And guess what? When I went to see Oregon, they did sets of their tunes linked together with improvised segues so that you would have an hour and a half worth of music straight through. And I don't think I realized it at the time, but wow, boy, looking back on it, when I put together a big band hour, with 3 or 4 or 5 tunes all segued together with improvisational segues, that seems to be a pretty big influence, right?
Yeah.
So then I also saw Zappa 2 or 3 times in the 80s, and he did the same thing. So those were the things that were really big influencing me, I guess, on a macro level. But, I saw a bunch of other jazz concerts in the 80s, like I saw Winton and Branford when they had the quintet with Kenny Kirkland at Blues Alley in D.C. I saw Warren Marsh in D.C. at One Step Down. These were, much smaller club dates. But in the 80s, I really started going to see jazz concerts in addition to the giant rock stadium concerts that I started going to in the 70s.
Let me ask you this. Why do you love jazz?
Well, I think it's the combination maybe of history and music and personality, all these things combined. When you study music, you're also studying history. So since I have such a big interest in history, you've got a whole historical component to learning about music when you study music. You know, if you're learning classical music, you're learning, you know, the history of culture and the history of music, the way music was used in different centuries or different eras, everything from, you know, Hildegard of Bingen up to Stravinsky and Takemitsu, you know, all the different eras of classical music for the last 1,000 years. And then you have a similar growth in jazz, where it started kind of as popular music in the early 20th century, and then went through all of its stylistic changes. So you study the history of the music that way, all the different style periods, and you develop an appreciation, hopefully, for the different kinds of sounds that people were making in different eras. So, again, we have this interest in history, combining with the more specialized interest in music, so music and music history. And then with jazz, you have, a lot of times you have the improvisational component, which is a sort of a graphic, explicit way to keep the music fresh. You have compositions that you work from. You have standard tunes maybe that you work from. But the way you play them and the way they come out is different every night because of the improvisational component. So combining improvisation with all these different musicians and the way their different personalities combine and interact together, combined with the historical component. I guess the reason why I like jazz is because it combines all these different disciplines and personalities in a way that's consistently and constantly interesting.
So let me ask you this. It's all going to come down to this. Everyone has a perception of you, your family, your friends, and those that are around you, but you know yourself best. Who do you think you are?
Who am I? I'll go to the eclectic world for the third time on this call. I consider myself an eclectic. Sometimes I've said hopelessly eclectic, because sometimes if you spread yourself around, you're missing out maybe on some super specialization where others can sort of latch on to what you're doing if you're kind of being super clear about your own music. But if I have music that combines, you know, ideas of classical counterpoint with jazz improvisation and, you know, the sonorities of rock and blues music with electric guitar and you know, not afraid to throw sprinkles of the avant-garde in alongside of, you know, pop music ideas or some simpler chords or progressions. That's the way I sort of see myself, as someone taking all these different influences that are now available to us ever since the dissemination of mass communications in the 20th century, where you're no longer restricted to hearing the music that's just in your town because you've got the radio and then you've got the internet and you've got all these different cultures of music from Africa to India to Europe to the Americas. You take all that music together and you develop a personal style that tries to include all of it. So I see myself as someone that's always trying to combine all the best music that I've come into contact with, the music that has spoken the most to me, and then when I try to write my own music, I think it all comes out sort of explaining all the intense listening and appreciation that I've been doing. And so when you hear my music, you sort of hear the whole story of my music listening career. And so that's the way I think of myself, as someone who takes music and puts it together and hopefully makes it so that others can latch on to the journey that I've been able to do. A little bit of a curation kind of thing where, you know, people have so many different things that they can listen to in my composing, And even in my teaching, I've found that my job a little bit is to provide some curation to other people. I used to be a radio DJ as well, so that's curation, right? You take what's available and you play the best of it, in the best situations. So curation and teaching and combining all my listening and learning of music into one life, and that's hopefully some kind of answer to that broad question.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. Really, really dug it. And hey, thank you for opening up about topics in American history and your life in music. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to yet another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in Brooklyn, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Chris for his time, his music, and his cool. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store. Visit neonjazz at youtube.com, and for everything Neon Jazz, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.